I always believed that betrayal was something that happened to other people, tragic stories you read in novels, dramatic scenes you see in movies, or whispered scandals shared in hushed tones at family gatherings. Never in my wildest imagination did I think it would happen to me, and not just by anyone, but by my own flesh and blood, my sister. For most of my life, family meant everything to me. Growing up, my sister and I were inseparable. Her name is Claire, 2 years younger than me, and though we fought like all siblings do, we always found our way back to laughter. She was my confidant, my shadow, the one I trusted with all my secrets. I never doubted her loyalty, never questioned her love. That blind trust, as I would later discover, would become the very knife she used to stab me in the back. It all began the night I introduced her to Daniel, my fiancé, my dream man, the one who had turned my world upside down with his charm, his wit, and the way he made me feel like the only woman in the room. We had been together for almost 3 years when he proposed, and I was over the moon. I wanted to shout it from the rooftops, to share my happiness with everyone, especially with my family. So naturally, I brought him home. The first time Daniel and Claire met, I noticed something strange. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, just a flicker of something in her eyes, a little too much attention in her smile. She leaned in closer when he spoke, laughed a little louder than necessary at his jokes, and touched his arm just a second too long. At the time, I brushed it off as nothing. Claire was always the more outgoing, flirtatious type, and I convinced myself she was just being her bubbly self. But deep inside, a whisper of discomfort had already begun to grow. Weeks passed, and preparations for the wedding consumed me. The dresses, the flowers, the endless meetings with planners. My life was a whirlwind of checklists and phone calls. Daniel seemed supportive, though at times distracted. He blamed work stress, late-night meetings, and urgent deadlines. I believed him, because I wanted to. Love has a way of making you blind to the cracks that others would easily see. Then came the day everything changed. It was a quiet Sunday afternoon. I had been flipping through invitation samples in my living room when I realized Claire hadn't stopped by in days. Normally, she was always around, offering to help with wedding errands or just hanging out. Curious, I decided to give her a call. The phone rang and rang, until finally, she answered, breathless, her voice hushed. "I can't talk right now," she whispered, before quickly hanging up. Something about her tone gnawed at me. Where was she? Why did she sound so guilty? My instinct screamed that something was off. Against my better judgment, I decided to drive to her apartment. Maybe she was sick, or maybe she was hiding something. I wasn't sure what I expected, but what I found shattered me. There they were, Daniel and Claire, together. I froze in the doorway. The key I had long ago been given to her place dangling in my trembling hand. They didn't hear me at first. He was on her couch, shirtless, and she sat beside him, her hand resting on his chest as if it belonged there. They were laughing, whispering, sharing an intimacy that cut deeper than any blade. When Claire finally saw me, her face drained of color. Daniel jumped up, fumbling for words that sounded like excuses but meant nothing. My world tilted, and for a moment, I couldn't breathe. Betrayal has a taste. It's metallic, bitter, like blood in your mouth. I left without a word. Tears blurred my vision as I stumbled back to my car, the weight of betrayal pressing down on my chest. My sister, my fiancé, the two people I trusted most had conspired against me in the cruelest way possible. That night, I lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling. The memories of every laugh, every secret, every hug with Claire replaying in my mind like a cruel montage. My heart ached, but beneath the pain, a new fire sparked. I would not crumble. I would not let them get away with it. If they thought I was weak, if they thought I would quietly bow out of my own life, they were gravely mistaken. I decided then and there, I would make them regret ever crossing me. But revenge isn't something you rush. It's not an impulsive outburst or a screaming match in the heat of betrayal. Real revenge is patient, calculated, and devastating. It's about letting them think they've won, only to reveal that the game has been yours all along. In the days that followed, I forced myself into calmness. I answered Claire's texts with short replies, pretending nothing was wrong. I smiled at Daniel when he came over, even kissed him on the cheek, while secretly memorizing every lie that rolled off his tongue. My silence was my weapon, and I was sharpening it with every passing day. But plotting revenge requires more than rage, it requires strategy. And I knew exactly where to begin. First, I gathered evidence, screenshots of their late-night messages that I managed to access when Daniel left his phone unattended, photos of their secret meetups, which weren't so secret once I began following them discreetly. Every detail, every slip, every kiss captured, stored away like ammunition waiting to be fired. Then came the next step, timing. My wedding was still weeks away, and they believed their secret affair was safe, perfect. Let them plan, let them scheme, let them bask in their stolen moments of passion. The longer they believed they had the upper hand, the sweeter the downfall would be. But little did they know, I was already setting the stage for their public humiliation. After the first shock, I learned to appear unaffected. I smiled at family dinners, accepted congratulations, and handled wedding planning with predictable cheer while a different kind of work took over my days. Revenge, I decided, would be precise, no shouting, no impulsive scenes. If I wanted them to regret crossing me, the punishment had to be inevitable and unmistakable. I told only to people about what I knew. Nia, my oldest friend, and my mother. Nia became my co-conspirator. She organized evidence, kept notes, and helped me plan logistics without ever losing her nerve. My mother offered steadiness, cooking meals on nights I felt hollow and reminding me that timing makes all the difference. I gathered proof with careful patience. Screenshots from moments when Daniel left his phone unattended. Photos taken from a distance when Claire assumed no one was watching. I recorded dates, times, and small details, what they said, how they touched, the cadence of their lies. The ledger I kept transformed my pain into actionable facts. When betrayal is cataloged, it stops being a ghost and becomes a tool. Rather than confront them immediately, I seeded doubt into their fragile confidence. A mutual friend would mention seeing Daniel at a late-night cafe. A delivery showed up at Claire's door at an odd hour. These small nudges loosened their composure without ever revealing my hand. They reacted with jitters and whispered reassurances to each other, unaware the web tightening around them was my doing. I also consulted a lawyer quietly, learning how prenuptial agreements and contractual obligations could be leveraged. I didn't want a courtroom spectacle, but I wanted to make sure there were no easy exits for them once the truth surfaced. Knowledge, I realized, is a form of power. The wedding became my stage. I drafted a speech that began like any grateful bride's, and turned into something else than organized presentation of facts with the cadence of inevitability. I practiced the pauses that would let each point land, the quiet moments that would make the audience lean in. In a room full of applause, my voice would separate illusion from reality. The night before the ceremony, Claire helped with last-minute details. laughing freely and oblivious as I slid a USB into the couch cushion, where she rested her head that night. On it I placed everything: photos, timestamps, message threads, candid shots taken by the photographer I'd booked under the guise of engagement portraits. Every piece arranged to answer any denial before it could be formed. On the day, while cameras clicked and guests chatted, I felt calm. My dress fit like a shield, silk and lace containing the storm under my ribs. When I stood to make my speech, the room hushed with that peculiar, expectant silence that attends rituals. I began warmly notes of gratitude, thank yous to family before letting my tone change almost imperceptibly. I spoke of how appearances can mask rot, of smiles that hide fractures, and how truth, once polished and presented, has a way of making people rethink everything they believed. Faces shifted. Daniel's smile faltered. Claire's cheeks drained of color. I let the silence sit like a held breath, and then played the first file. The footage was unavoidable. A rainy afternoon at their cafe. A clear shot of Claire and Daniel leaning close, voices soft and intimate. Timestamps matched their alibis. Messages on screen revealed intent rather than a single weakness. The audience exhaled collectively as the pieces slotted together. Daniel scrambled for explanations. Claire wept. Denials came like echoes, thin and rehearsed, but each was answered with another clip, another screenshot, another conversation I had logged carefully in my ledger. I was careful. The aim was to leave no plausible deniability. The room split quickly. Some guests recoiled, stunned into silence. Others whispered in conspiratorial knots. Aunts clutched napkins. Friends exchanged looks that asked for guidance. The polarized murmur was exactly what I expected. People prefer tidy stories, but betrayal forces messy rearrangements. Public humiliation was only one part of the plan. With the help of counsel, I enforced vendor agreements and deposits, ensuring cancellations would be costly. Venues required fees, caterers had non-refundable clauses, and the logistics of an unraveled wedding meant financial consequences as well as social ones. I wanted their choices to carry weight beyond humiliation. In the weeks after, gossip moved faster than I ever imagined. My name became a hinge. Some admired how I reclaimed my story. Others called me merciless. I accepted both. My goal had not been to win a popularity contest, but to take back agency. I focused on work, friends, and small daily routines that stitched me back together. Claire and Daniel managed the aftermath differently. Daniel retreated into work, offering apologies that felt porous. Claire tried explanations, but the structure of proof I'd presented made them hollow. Family members took sides. Relationships strained or snapped. The social map shifted, and with that shift came consequences neither of them had foreseen. Revenge delivered a brittle satisfaction. It didn't heal the hurt entirely, but it dismantled the illusion of innocence they'd enjoyed. More importantly, it placed me back at the center of my own life, not as a passive sufferer, but as someone who could direct the narrative toward truth. Even now, when I walk past mirrors, I remember that sting and the strange, steady power that came with choosing how the story would end. There were nights when the silence returned and memories pressed like cold hands, but even those moments became part of the repair. Friends showed up with coffee, with small acts that mattered more than any grand gesture. I learned to set boundaries, to keep certain people at arm's length, and to invest time in people who chose truth. In quiet hours, I rebuilt trust not in others but in myself, carving a life that no one could disturb without consent. The cost had been high, but the reclamation felt essential, and I would not forget this. Word count: 1,000. Cumulative: 2,000 *. After the wedding day debacle, The silence that followed was louder than the chaos itself. For days, my phone buzzed with messages from relatives, acquaintances, and even strangers who had heard about what happened. Some called me brave, others called me cruel. But every opinion, no matter how divided, confirmed one thing. I had taken control of my story. The whispers no longer revolved around what Daniel and Claire had done behind my back. They revolved around how I had exposed them. I spent the first week after the reveal in a strange limbo. My body felt drained, as though I had run a marathon with no finish line. But my mind was alive, sharper than it had been in years. I replayed the scene in my head, the stunned faces, the gasps, the way Daniel's hand twitched as if searching for an excuse he could never find. And Claire, my sister, shrinking into her seat like a child caught stealing candy. Except her theft had been something far greater. My trust, my love, my future. What surprised me most was how quickly sympathy came from unexpected places. A cousin who had barely spoken to me at family gatherings suddenly sent long, heartfelt texts. Old friends reappeared, offering support. Even colleagues at work, who normally kept their distance, dropped by my desk to check in. People are drawn to stories where justice feels tangible, and for them, mine was proof that betrayal doesn't always go unanswered. But beneath the supportive messages lay a deeper challenge. How to rebuild myself after the storm. It's one thing to destroy a lie. It's another to live in the ruins it leaves behind. I knew Daniel was gone for good, but Claire was different. She wasn't just an ex-fiancé I could block and erase. She was family, tied to me by blood and memories that reached back to childhood. Cutting her out would be both liberating and devastating. The first time she tried to contact me after the wedding, it was through a letter slipped under my door. The handwriting was unmistakable, rounded, hurried, the way she used to scribble notes during school. I picked it up and stared at it for hours before finally opening it. Inside, she wrote of regret, of weakness, of how she never meant to hurt me but had fallen in love unexpectedly. She begged for forgiveness, claimed she was confused, that Daniel had pursued her first. It was a messy attempt at absolution, filled with excuses that felt rehearsed. I didn't respond. Some wounds are too deep for words. Instead, I tucked the letter into a box with all the other evidence I had collected, a monument to betrayal. A reminder, should I ever forget, that trust once broken cannot be patched with apologies. Daniel, on the other hand, tried a different tactic. He showed up at my office one afternoon, his tie loosened, his eyes heavy with exhaustion. Security had to be called before he left, but not before spitting out a desperate plea for another chance. He claimed Claire had manipulated him, that he had been weak, that he still loved me. The irony nearly made me laugh. This was the same man who had whispered promises of forever while sneaking around with my sister. Love, I realized, is only as strong as the choices it inspires, and his choices spoke louder than any declaration ever could. I didn't need his love. I needed my dignity, and I had already reclaimed it. Still, healing wasn't linear. Nights were the hardest. I'd lie awake, the memories unspooling in cruel detail. Daniel's proposal under fairy lights, Claire's smile at my engagement party, the plans we made together for a future that never was. Grief has layers, and I grieved not only the loss of a relationship but also the death of the sisterhood. I thought unshakable to move forward. I focused on building new rhythms, morning runs that cleared my head, journals where I poured every thought, unfiltered and raw, coffee dates with Nia, who reminded me through laughter that life could still be bright. Slowly, the pain dulled, replaced by something harder, more resilient. I was no longer the woman who trusted blindly. I was someone sharper, someone who knew the cost of betrayal and the value of boundaries. In the midst of this rebuilding, an opportunity presented itself, one I hadn't anticipated. A local women's group reached out after hearing my story through a mutual acquaintance. They invited me to speak at one of their events, not about revenge, but about resilience. At first, I hesitated. I wasn't sure I had anything to offer beyond my pain. But when I stood before that room of strangers and told them how I had faced betrayal and chosen to expose it rather than hide, I felt a power I hadn't expected. My story resonated. Heads nodded, eyes welled with tears, and afterward, women approached me to share their own tales of heartbreak and survival. That night, I realized something important. Revenge had given me closure, but resilience gave me purpose. I didn't just want to be the woman who exposed her cheating fiancé and sister. I wanted to be the woman who turned devastation into strength, who showed others that no matter how deep the cut, healing was possible. Of course, Claire and Daniel weren't done with each other. Rumors trickled back to me they tried to make a relationship out of their betrayal. But trust built on treachery is brittle. Friends reported fights, public arguments, and eventually, a quiet separation. Watching from a distance, I felt no triumph, only a kind of detached inevitability. They had destroyed themselves the moment they betrayed me. I had simply accelerated the unveiling. Months passed, and my life began to resemble something new. Not the life I had planned, but one I was crafting deliberately. I invested time in projects I had put aside during my engagement. I traveled with Nia to places Daniel had never wanted to visit, finding joy and freedom I hadn't realized I had given up. And slowly, the laughter returned, not the brittle, forced laughter of survival, but genuine, full-bodied laughter that came from knowing I had survived and was still standing. Yet through it all, one thought stayed with me. Betrayal doesn't define you unless you let it. Claire and Daniel's actions could have broken me permanently, left me bitter and hollow. But instead, they became the catalyst for transformation. I wasn't just surviving, I was evolving. And though part of me would always ache for the sister I thought I had, another part knew this truth. Sometimes, losing someone is the only way to find yourself. Asterisk. The aftermath of betrayal has a way of rearranging everything you thought you knew about yourself. I used to define myself through others, through being a loyal daughter, a devoted sister, a loving partner. But after the implosion of my engagement and the revelation of Claire's deceit, I began to see my identity less as a reflection of others and more as something I had to carve out for myself. But first, it felt lonely. The kind of loneliness that creeps in even when you're surrounded by people. I'd walk into a crowded cafe and see couples holding hands, siblings laughing together, and I'd feel a hollow ache in my chest. It wasn't envy, it was grief for what I'd lost, for what had been stolen from me. But grief, I learned, can be a sculptor. It chips away at you until you're forced to uncover the core of who you really are. That was when I threw myself into work. My career had always been important, but during my relationship with Daniel, I had unconsciously prioritized his ambitions over mine. I'd scheduled vacations around his deadlines, turned down promotions that might have conflicted with our future plans. Now, unshackled, I accepted new responsibilities. I stayed late at the office not because I had to, but because it energized me to see my own progress, independent of anyone else. Success came quickly, perhaps because I had redirected all the energy I once spent nurturing others into nurturing myself. Within 6 months, I had been promoted to lead a major project. My team respected me, not just for my competence but for my resilience. They knew my story whispers had reached them, too, but instead of pity, I felt admiration in their eyes. It was a strange kind of validation. To be recognized not for the disaster I had endured but for the way I rose above it. Claire, meanwhile, remained a ghost on the edges of my life. Occasionally, I'd hear her name through family channels. A cousin mentioned she was struggling financially. An aunt said she'd been spotted alone at a cafe, staring into her coffee as though it held answers she couldn't find. I didn't ask for details, but I absorbed them quietly. She had made her choices, and now she was living in their aftermath. One day, months after the wedding that never was, I ran into her by accident. It was at the supermarket of all places. I turned a corner with my basket, and there she was, holding a carton of milk. Her hair tied up messily, dark circles under her eyes. For a moment, we froze, to statues carved from the same stone, yet fractured in different ways. She opened her mouth as if to speak, but no words came. Her eyes shimmered with a cocktail of shame, sadness, and something I couldn't identify. I gave her a small nod and walked past without a word. My silence said more than forgiveness ever could. It said, "I remember. I know who you are now, and I don't owe you anything." That encounter haunted me for days, not because I longed for reconciliation, but because it cemented the finality of what had happened. The sister I once loved with all my heart was gone. What stood in her place was a stranger, a cautionary tale of what happens when selfishness overrules loyalty. Daniel tried reaching out a few more times after his initial attempt at my office. He sent flowers, left voicemails, even wrote a long email about how he was seeking therapy and discovering the roots of his mistakes. I deleted it without finishing. He was no longer part of my story. If Claire had become a ghost on the edges of my life, Daniel had become a shadow erased by the light of my new beginning. I poured myself into other things: travel, hobbies, friendships. Nia and I started a small side project together, a blog where we wrote about resilience, heartbreak, and personal growth. What began as a way to process my emotions turned into a community of readers who found comfort in our words. Messages poured in from women across the world, each with their own story of betrayal and recovery. Reading their experiences reminded me that pain is universal, but so is healing. Through that platform, I learned the power of vulnerability. By sharing my scars, I wasn't reopening wounds, I was helping others see that theirs could heal, too. The blog grew beyond what I had imagined, attracting invitations for podcasts, panels, and even television interviews. Each time I spoke publicly, I felt that old ache lessen. My pain was no longer just mine. It had become fuel for something greater, and yet, in quiet moments, I still thought about what might have been. It's impossible not to. I imagined the wedding I once planned, the life I thought I would share with Daniel, the sisterly bond I believed unbreakable. Those daydreams were bittersweet, but I didn't dwell on them long. Instead, I focused on the life I had now, one that was honest, self-directed, and full of possibilities I had never considered before. One evening, while journaling, I wrote a sentence that stuck with me. Revenge gave me closure, but resilience gave me freedom. It was true. Exposing Claire and Daniel had been necessary, cathartic even. But the real victory lay in not letting their betrayal define me. The best revenge wasn't humiliating them, it was thriving without them. It was around this time that love, uninvited, tiptoed back into my life. His name was Marcus, a colleague from another department whom I had known in passing for years. He wasn't flashy like Daniel, nor did he sweep me off my feet with grand gestures. Instead, he showed up consistently with kindness, with respect, with patience. He listened more than he spoke, noticed details others overlooked, and never once made me feel like I had to shrink myself to fit his world. At first, I resisted. My heart was wary, scarred, protective. But Marcus never pushed. He simply stayed, offering friendship, laughter, and quiet support. Slowly, brick by brick, he dismantled the walls I had built. And one day, without realizing when it began, I found myself smiling again, not the guarded smile of survival, but the genuine smile of someone who dares to believe in love once more. Claire and Daniel's betrayal had destroyed one version of my life, but perhaps it had also cleared the path for a better one. Asterisk. Falling for Marcus was not a thunderclap. It was not the dizzying rush of adrenaline that had swept me off my feet when I first met Daniel. It was slower, gentler, like the steady warmth of sunlight that you don't notice until your skin begins to glow. Perhaps that's what made it feel real, because love that survives betrayal cannot be reckless. It must be deliberate. He never pressured me to define us. He never demanded a timeline. He simply let me heal in his presence, giving me room to breathe. We shared lunches that turned into dinners, walks that stretched longer than planned, conversations that drifted late into the night. He asked about my dreams, not just my wounds, and when I spoke, he listened as if every word mattered. One evening, sitting across from him at a quiet cafe, I realized something startling. I was laughing, not politely, not cautiously, but freely, the way I used to before my world collapsed. Marcus grinned, not because he'd said something funny, but because he was watching me come alive. And in that moment, I knew this was not about replacing Daniel. This was about rediscovering myself. Still, shadows lingered. Trust is not rebuilt overnight. There were moments when Marcus's phone would buzz late at night, and a flicker of old paranoia would grip me. Moments when he'd mention a female colleague, and I'd feel the faintest sting of doubt. He never gave me a reason to mistrust him. But scars don't vanish simply because someone new is gentle instead of hiding those fears. I spoke them aloud. Sometimes I worry I'll never be able to trust again, I confessed one night, my voice trembling. Marcus didn't flinch. He reached for my hand and said, "Then let me earn it. Every day. Until you do." His words weren't promises, they were commitments. And they mattered more than any hollow vow Daniel had ever made. Meanwhile, Claire drifted further into isolation. Family gatherings became awkward. She stopped attending altogether. My parents, torn between loyalty to both their daughters, struggled with how to navigate the rift. My mother called me often, gently probing if I might ever forgive Claire. But forgiveness, I realized, is not a switch you flip. It's a long, winding road, and I hadn't even taken the first step. Sometimes, late at night, I wondered what forgiveness would even look like. Would it mean inviting her back into my life as though nothing had happened? Or would it mean releasing the anger while still keeping my distance? I didn't have the answer, and perhaps I didn't need one yet. Healing doesn't always require reconciliation. Sometimes, it just requires peace. Daniel, on the other hand, faded like an old photograph. Rumors said he had moved to another city, chasing work opportunities and leaving behind the wreckage he'd caused. I didn't follow his story. I didn't need to. His chapter in my life was closed, sealed, and shelved. The blog Nia and I had started continued to grow. Our words resonated with people who were navigating heartbreak, betrayal, and resilience. The more we shared, the more messages poured in from readers thanking us for giving voice to their pain. One woman wrote that reading my story gave her the courage to leave a toxic marriage. Another said she finally confronted her cheating partner after months of silence. Each message reminded me that even the ugliest wounds can bloom into something meaningful when shared with honesty. Eventually, An editor from a publishing house reached out. She had been following the blog and believed there was a book in my story, a memoir about betrayal, revenge, and resilience. The idea both thrilled and terrified me. Writing a blog post was one thing, but bearing my soul in a book that would sit on shelves for strangers to dissect, that was another level of vulnerability. But then I remembered the night I had spoken at that women's group. The way my words had lit a spark in others. Maybe this was the next step, not just for me, but for everyone who needed proof that survival was possible. So I said yes. The process of writing forced me to relive everything, every smile that turned into a lie, every tear that fell in the dark, every calculated step of my revenge. At times it was exhausting, dredging up memories I'd tried to bury. But it was also liberating. By putting the story on paper, I was no longer carrying it inside me like a weight. I was releasing it, transforming it into something that could help others. Marcus supported me through it all. He'd bring me tea during late-night writing sessions, listen patiently when I read passages aloud, and remind me to rest when the memories became too heavy. His presence was steady, unshaken by the storm I was revisiting. With him, I felt safe enough to confront the past without fear of drowning in it. By the time the book was published, I had come to a profound realization. Revenge had been necessary to reclaim my dignity. But it wasn't the end of the story. The true victory was not in watching Claire and Daniel fall, it was in rising beyond them, building a life so full and rich that their betrayal became only the prologue to something greater. The launch was a success. Readers connected with my honesty, my rawness, my refusal to paint myself as either a saint or a victim. I was simply human, flawed and hurting, but determined to rebuild. The book opened doors I never expected: speaking engagements, interviews, panels on resilience. Each time I shared my story, I felt the sting of the past lesson. What once felt like a scarlet letter now felt like a badge of survival, and through it all, Marcus was by my side, not in the spotlight, not demanding attention, but quietly supportive. His presence a reminder that love, when true, doesn't need theatrics. It just needs consistency. One evening, after a particularly successful event, Marcus took my hand and said, "You know, you turned your pain into something powerful. That's the kind of strength people remember." I smiled, not because of the compliment, but because I finally believed it myself. I wasn't just the woman who had been betrayed. I was the woman who had risen, who had rebuilt, who had turned ashes into firelight. Asterisk. The more my life expanded, the smaller Claire and Daniel became in my story. It was as if I had once been trapped in a room with them, suffocated by betrayal. And now I had stepped outside into an endless horizon. The air was fresher, the colors brighter, and I realized that freedom isn't just about leaving the past behind, it's about no longer letting it define your present. Yet life has a way of testing the strength of your healing. One afternoon, nearly 2 years after the wedding that never happened, I received an invitation in the mail. It was from Claire. My hands trembled as I opened the envelope, unsure of what awaited me. Inside was a handwritten letter, shaky, uneven script I almost didn't recognize. She wrote that she was sorry, that her choices had destroyed not only our bond but her own sense of self. She confessed that the life she thought she wanted with Daniel had crumbled. They were no longer together. He had left her the same way he had left me, abruptly, selfishly, with no thought for the wreckage left behind. Her words were heavy with regret, pleading for a chance at reconciliation. I sat with that letter for days. Part of me felt vindicated. Another part felt hollow. Was this justice? Seeing her abandoned, alone, reaching out for the very sister she had betrayed. Or was it just another cycle of manipulation? I showed the letter to Marcus, unsure of what to do. He didn't tell me what choice to make. He simply asked, "What would give you peace?" It was the right question, though the answer wasn't simple. After much thought, I agreed to meet her, not because I wanted her back in my life, but because I needed to close the chapter on my own terms. We met at a quiet park. She looked different, smaller somehow, as though the weight of her guilt had carved her down. When she saw me, tears spilled immediately. She apologized again and again, words tumbling out like a flood she could no longer hold back. I listened, my face calm, my heart steady. "Do you know what hurt the most?" I asked finally. "It wasn't losing Daniel. It was losing you. You were my sister, my best friend, and you chose to betray me." She sobbed, nodding, unable to meet my eyes. "I know. I wish I could undo it. I'd give anything to go back. But we both knew time doesn't work that way. Regret doesn't erase scars. Apologies don't rebuild trust overnight. I don't hate you," I said softly. Her head jerked up in surprise. "But I also can't go back to what we were. Maybe one day we can build something new, but it won't ever be the same." Her tears fell harder, but this time there was acceptance in them. She understood. For the first time, I saw not the rival who had stolen my life, but the broken woman left behind after her own choices had turned to ash. We parted with a fragile truce, not reconciliation, not complete forgiveness, but an acknowledgement of the truth. It was enough for me. In the weeks that followed, I felt lighter, not because Claire and I were suddenly close again, but because I had finally taken control of the narrative. I wasn't running from the past anymore. I had faced it head on and walked away with my dignity intact. Marcus noticed the change. "You're different," he said one evening as we cooked dinner together. "Calmer, freer." "I think I finally closed the book," I replied. Life with him was simple, steady, and beautiful in ways I hadn't thought possible. He didn't rescue me, I had rescued myself, but he stood beside me as I rebuilt. And that made all the difference. When my book hit its 1-year anniversary, I was invited to speak at a major conference about resilience and empowerment. Standing on that stage, looking out at hundreds of faces, I felt a rush of gratitude, not for the betrayal that had broken me, but for the strength I had discovered in the aftermath. I told the audience something I had only recently come to understand. Revenge may give you satisfaction in the moment, but resilience will give you freedom for a lifetime. The applause was thunderous, but the real victory was internal. I no longer needed validation, revenge, or closure from anyone else. I had found it within myself. Months later, Marcus proposed, not with extravagance or spectacle, but with quiet sincerity. We were on a hike, surrounded by trees, when he pulled out a simple ring and asked, "Will you keep building with me?" Tears filled my eyes as I said yes, not because I needed marriage to feel complete, but because I had found someone who understood. That love isn't about possession, it's about partnership. Our wedding was nothing like the one I had once planned. It was smaller, more intimate, filled with people who truly loved and supported us. Nia stood by my side as maid of honor, beaming with pride. My parents cried tears of joy, relief etched into their faces. Even Claire attended, sitting quietly at the back, not drawing attention to herself. It was strange, seeing her there, but not painful. We were no longer enemies, just two women walking different paths, bound by history but no longer defined by betrayal. As I exchanged vows with Marcus, I felt an overwhelming sense of peace. I wasn't marrying to escape loneliness or to prove anything. I was marrying because I had already built a life I loved, and I wanted to share it with someone who honored that life rather than diminished it. In the years that followed, my story continued to inspire others. The book reached more readers. The blog grew, and I found myself traveling the world to speak about resilience, betrayal, and healing. Each story I heard from others reminded me that while betrayal is universal, so is strength. Claire and I never returned to what we once had, but we found a cautious, distant peace. We exchanged holiday cards, occasional texts, nothing more. It was enough. Forgiveness didn't mean restoration, it meant release. And release was all I needed. Looking back, I no longer saw myself as the woman who had been betrayed. I saw myself as the woman who had transformed betrayal into empowerment, who had taken ashes and built something stronger, brighter, and freer. And if I could go back to that day when everything collapsed to the moment I stood in my wedding dress, heartbroken, humiliated, I wouldn't change it. Because that was the day my true life began. Years later, when I reflect on everything, the sharp edges of the story soften. Time has a way of sanding down even the deepest wounds, leaving only the lessons behind. The betrayal that once defined me now feels like just one chapter in a much larger book, painful, yes, but necessary for the transformation that followed. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if Claire hadn't betrayed me. If Daniel and I had gone through with the wedding, would I have discovered my own strength? Would I have built the career, the community, the life that I now cherish? Or would I have continued living in the shadow of someone else's dreams, never realizing the power of my own? It's strange to say, but in some ways, their betrayal gave me a gift. Not because it was good, but because it forced me to grow. It pushed me out of a life built on illusion and into one forged in truth. I think often about the women who write to me after reading my book or hearing me speak. They tell me my story gave them courage, that it reminded them they weren't alone, that it helped them see betrayal not as the end, but as a brutal kind of beginning. Those messages are worth more than any revenge could ever be. They are proof that pain, when shared, can be transformed into power. Marcus and I live a life that is quiet, grounded, and deeply fulfilling. We laugh often, argue sometimes, forgive quickly. He never asks me to forget my past, only to keep moving forward with him. And that's what I do, every day. As for Claire, she remains a shadow at the edges of my life. We are not close, and we never will be. But when I see her name on a holiday card, I don't feel rage anymore. I feel acceptance. We both made our choices, and we both live with their consequences. That's enough. Daniel, wherever he is, no longer matters. His absence is not a wound, it's freedom. If I could offer one truth to anyone standing where I once stood in the ruins of betrayal, heart in shards, future uncertain, it would be this: you are stronger than you think. Betrayal may break you, but it can also reveal you. Revenge may feel like victory, but resilience will make you unstoppable. My story began with pain, but it ends with peace. And that is the greatest revenge of all.